Have you ever wondered what darkness can hide beneath the holiest of robes? What if I told you that one of the most sacred pilgrimages on earth concealed something so terrible, so inhumane, that even those who witnessed it struggled to believe their own eyes? The year was 1859. The place, the ancient roads leading to Medina. Thousands of faithful souls walked those dusty paths each year, seeking spiritual purification, forgiveness, divine blessing. But among those caravans, among those white-robed pilgrims lifting their voices in prayer, something else moved. Something that preferred the cover of night. Something that turned human beings into merchandise. This is not a story from distant centuries. This happened barely 160 years ago. And the woman who would eventually tear away the veil from this horror, she walked among those same pilgrims, carrying chains instead of prayers, carrying trauma instead of hope. If you stay with me through this account, you will witness one of the most audacious acts of resistance ever documented in the history of the African slave trade. You will meet a woman whose name was deliberately erased from official records, yet whose actions sent shockwaves through 3 continents. You will understand why certain powers wanted this story buried forever. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that truth deserves to survive, because what I'm about to reveal to you, they never wanted you to know. Let us begin. The sun sets over the Arabian Peninsula in the year of our narrative. The light bleeds across the horizon like a wound that refuses to heal. Somewhere between the Red Sea coast and the Holy City, a caravan stretches across the landscape like a great serpent made of camels, donkeys, and human feet. From a distance, it appears ordinary. Perhaps 200 pilgrims, their white garments catching the dying light, their voices rising in evening prayers. The call to Maghrib echoes across the sand. Heads bow, bodies prostrate. The dust settles around them like a benediction. But something is wrong with this picture. Look closer. Notice how some figures do not bow when the others bow. Notice how certain shapes remain hunched, clustered together near the center of the caravan. Notice the occasional glint of metal that has nothing to do with cooking pots or water vessels. This is the world we enter. A world where the sacred and the profane have become so intertwined that separating them requires more than legal proclamations or diplomatic agreements. It requires blood. It requires sacrifice. It requires a woman named Amara. The British Empire had officially abolished the slave trade in 1807. By 1833, they had banned slavery itself throughout their colonies. But here, in 1859, the trade continued. Not in the open markets of old, but in shadows, in disguises, in the holy caravans that no European inspector dared to thoroughly search. The Hejaz pilgrimage route had become the most sophisticated smuggling corridor in human history. And Amara walked it in chains. She was 32 years old. Originally from the shores of Lake Tanganyika, she had been captured during a raid when she was 24. 8 years of slavery had taken her across half a continent and an entire sea. She had been sold 4 times, escaped twice, been recaptured twice, and now she found herself walking toward the holy city not as a pilgrim, but as property. The caravan that held her was led by a man named Rashid al-Masri. He presented himself to Ottoman authorities as a merchant of spices and textiles. His documentation was immaculate, his bribery more immaculate still. For 11 years, he had operated this route without serious interference. His method was elegant in its cruelty. The legitimate pilgrims, mostly poor faithful from North Africa and the Levant, paid reduced rates to join his caravan. They provided perfect cover. During the day, when the caravan might encounter Ottoman patrols or European observers, the enslaved walked among the pilgrims dressed in pilgrim white, their chains hidden beneath flowing garments, their silence ensured by threats against the children who walked among them. At night, when the caravan made camp, the reality reasserted itself. The enslaved were separated, chained openly, fed last and least. They slept on bare ground while the pilgrims rested on carpets. They relieved themselves under guard. They spoke only when spoken to. Amara observed everything. If you want to follow more cases like this, ones that shake society to its core and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss any investigation. To understand what Amara witnessed, we must understand the system she was trapped within. The pilgrimage slave trade operated on a scale that has never been fully acknowledged by historians. Conservative estimates suggest that between 1820 and 1880, at least 100,000 enslaved Africans were transported via pilgrimage routes. Some scholars put the number at 3 times that. The system worked through layers of complicity that extended from the shores of East Africa to the palaces of Istanbul. At the source, raiders operated with tacit approval from local powers. They targeted villages during harvest season, when populations were concentrated and resistance was minimal. They preferred to capture women and children, who were easier to control and commanded higher prices. They killed the elderly and the defiant, leaving bodies as warnings to survivors. The captives walked in coffles, chained together in lines of 20 or 30, force-marched toward the coast. Those who fell were left to die. Those who resisted were beaten until they stopped resisting or stopped breathing. The mortality rate on these initial marches approached 40%. At the coast, the survivors were warehoused in holding pens, inspected, sorted by age and health and appearance. They were sold to brokers who arranged their transport across the Red Sea. The dhows that carried them were designed for speed, not human cargo. Deaths during the crossing were built into the price. On the Arabian coast, another set of brokers received them. Here began the transformation that made the system so insidious. The new arrivals were given new names, new identities. They were taught basic Arabic phrases, dressed in appropriate clothing, documented as servants or family members of established residents. Some were kept in Arabia. Others continued to the final stage, the pilgrimage caravans. The genius of using the pilgrimage was simple. Who would dare interrupt a Hajj caravan? What Ottoman official would risk eternal damnation by harassing pilgrims? What European consul would create a diplomatic incident over mere suspicion? And so the trade continued. Year after year, caravan after caravan, life after stolen life. Rashid al-Masri was not the largest operator, but he was among the most successful. His caravan of 1859 contained 43 enslaved individuals, hidden among 180 legitimate pilgrims. The enslaved included Amara and 17 other adults, plus 25 children ranging from 6 years old to 15. Among those children was a girl named Safia. She was 12. She reminded Amara of her own daughter, the one she had been forced to leave behind when she was first captured. The resemblance was not physical. It was something in the eyes. A defiance that had not yet been beaten out. A spark that still flickered. Amara made a decision. She did not know yet what she would do, but she knew that this caravan would not reach its destination intact. Amara was not her birth name. She had carried 3 names before this one. Her first name, the one her mother gave her by the shores of the Great Lake, she kept locked in a part of her mind that no owner had ever accessed. That name was hers alone. She had been the daughter of a fisherman and a healer. Her mother knew the plants that cured fevers, eased childbirth, closed wounds. Before she was captured, Amara had learned much of this knowledge. She had learned which roots dissolved in water without leaving traces. She had learned which leaves, when burned, produced smoke that brought sleep. She had learned which berries looked like food but were anything but. These skills had kept her valuable. At each sale, she had presented herself as a healer, and each owner had found uses for her abilities. She had tended to sick children and ailing wives. She had delivered babies and closed wounds. She had made herself indispensable, but she had also made herself invisible. The healer who moved freely through a household, the slave who knew where the medicines were kept, the woman who could enter any room under the guise of tending to someone's health. In her 8 years of captivity, she had memorized the layouts of 4 different households. She had learned the schedules of guards and the habits of masters. She had noted which doors creaked and which windows could be opened silently. This knowledge had enabled her escapes. It had also enabled her recaptures. Twice she had trusted the wrong people. Twice she had been betrayed by those she thought were allies. She had learned that freedom required more than opportunity. It required a plan that did not depend on others. Now, walking in this caravan, she applied her observational skills to a new purpose. She counted the guards. Rashid employed 12 men as escorts, but only 6 of them were true fighters. The others were handlers, primarily responsible for managing the camels and maintaining discipline among the enslaved. At night, no more than 3 guards remained awake at any time, and they took shifts that left them drowsy by the hour before dawn. She noted the weapons. The guards carried mainly clubs and whips, tools of control rather than combat. Only Rashid and his 2 senior men carried firearms, old flintlock pistols that required time to load and were unreliable in the desert dust. The fighters had swords, but they wore them loosely, confidently, like men who had never faced real resistance. She studied the terrain. The route to Medina passed through several narrow valleys where a caravan would be vulnerable. There were places where water sources forced specific camping locations. There were stretches where the road passed close enough to towns that sounds might carry. She cataloged the pilgrims. Most were too absorbed in their own spiritual journeys to notice the horror walking among them. But a few had compassionate eyes. A few had noticed the strange silence of certain children. A few might be willing to look the other way at a critical moment. And she watched the children. 25 of them. All traumatized. All obedient. All valuable merchandise. All capable of running if someone showed them when and where and how. Leave in the comments, never give up on truth if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. The caravan moved slowly, limited by the pace of its most burdened members. Each day brought new demonstrations of the system's cruelty. There was the morning when a boy of perhaps 10 years collapsed from exhaustion. A guard beat him until he rose, then beat him more for having fallen in the first place. The pilgrims watched. Some turned away. None intervened. The boy walked the rest of that day with blood drying on his back, salt crystals forming in the wounds as he sweated under the sun. There was the night when one of the adult enslaved men, a tall figure from somewhere in the western regions, tried to speak with a pilgrim. He had recognized something, perhaps a dialect, perhaps a face from his past. The guard who caught him speaking made an example. They staked the man to the ground and left him there until morning, exposed to the cold desert night while the caravan slept around his shivering form. There was the afternoon when the water ran short and the enslaved were given nothing while the pilgrims drank their fill. A woman among the enslaved begged for water for her child, a boy of perhaps 3 years who had stopped crying only because he lacked the moisture for tears. Rashid himself responded. He poured water onto the sand while the woman watched, then told her that disobedient property did not deserve sustenance. The child survived only because Amara shared her own ration that night, going thirsty so that the boy might live. There were the constant small humiliations. The way guards referred to them as animals, as cargo, as things. The way pilgrims walked past them without acknowledgement, as though they did not exist. The way children were separated from mothers each night, deliberately, to ensure cooperation through terror. Through all of this, Amara watched. She absorbed. She remembered. She noticed which guards were cruel for pleasure and which were cruel only for duty. She noted which pilgrims seemed troubled by what they witnessed and which were complicit in their indifference. She observed how information flowed through the caravan, how orders were given and received, how decisions were made. She was building a map, not of geography, but of power, not of terrain, but of human weakness. And she was waiting. 12 days into the journey, the caravan made camp near a cluster of wells known to travelers for generations. The place had a name in Arabic that translated roughly as the Gathering of Strangers. It was a crossing point where different routes converged, where caravans might encounter each other, where news and rumors spread. That evening, Rashid received visitors. 3 men from another caravan, heading in the opposite direction toward the coast. They shared tea and conversation while the camp settled into its nighttime routines. Amara was assigned to serve them. This was not unusual. She had medical knowledge, and sometimes important guests required her attention. But tonight, she was merely carrying a tray of dates and figs, playing the role of obedient servant while her ears caught every word. The men from the other caravan were brokers. They had heard about Rashid's cargo. They were interested in making an early purchase before the caravan reached Medina. One of them wanted a particular type of merchandise. young, female, no older than 13. They were negotiating for Sophia. Amara placed the tray on the carpet, keeping her head bowed, her movements slow, giving herself time to hear more. Rashid was agreeable. The price suggested was fair. But there was a problem. The buyer wanted to take his purchase immediately, to transport her back with his own caravan. Rashid explained that this would complicate his documentation. He had registered a certain number of servants entering Medina. He would need to register the same number. Missing one would raise questions. The solution they reached made Amara's blood turn cold. They would sell Sophia now, to travel with the buyer. But they would replace her. There was a pilgrim family in the caravan, poor people from somewhere in North Africa, traveling with a daughter of approximately the right age. Rashid would claim the daughter as an unregistered servant. The family would be told that their child had been found ill and must remain behind for treatment. They would be compensated with enough money to continue their pilgrimage. They would never see their daughter again. They were planning to enslave a free child to balance their books. Something changed in Amara at that moment. For 8 years, she had focused on survival. She had told herself that endurance was its own form of resistance. She had convinced herself that staying alive meant she might someday find a way home, might someday see her own daughter again. But there are limits. There are lines that, once crossed, transform caution into cowardice. There are moments when survival at any cost becomes survival without purpose. She had no plan yet. She had no allies. She had no weapons. But she had a deadline. 3 days until the caravan reached the town where the transfer would occur. 3 days to change everything. The next morning, Amara began her work. She started with the woman whose child she had saved. Her name was Casey. She was perhaps 40 years old, though hardship had aged her face beyond counting. She was from the southern regions, from the Lake Territories, from the same world Amara had been torn away from 8 years before. They spoke in the old language, the one the guards did not understand, disguising their conversation as prayer. Amara told her what she had overheard. She told her about the plan to take Sophia and steal the pilgrim's daughter. She asked if Casey was willing to die trying to prevent this. Casey's answer was simple. She had already died the day they took her from her home. Everything since then had been merely existing. If there was a chance to make that existence mean something, she would take it. That night, Amara approached another of the enslaved adults. His name among them was Kofi. He was perhaps 25, strong despite the deprivations of the journey, quiet in the way of men who have learned that words can be weapons used against them. Amara had watched him. She had seen how he positioned himself near the children during the day, how he absorbed blows meant for smaller bodies, how he kept a rock hidden in his clothing that could have been a weapon but had never been used. She told him everything. She asked him to trust her. He asked a single question. What about the children? She had no good answer. Any action they took would put the children in danger. Doing nothing would condemn Safia and an innocent pilgrim's daughter to fates worse than the danger. There were no good choices. There were only choices. Kofi joined her. Over the next day, she recruited 3 more. Jasiri, an older woman who had once been a midwife and understood Amara's medical knowledge. Tembo, a young man barely past boyhood himself, but with a fury burning behind his eyes that years of subjugation had failed to extinguish. And most crucially, a man whose enslaved name was Malik, but who had been a warrior before his capture, who still remembered how to kill. 6 people, against 12 guards and whatever pilgrims might intervene. The odds were impossible. But Amara had learned something in 8 years of captivity. She had learned that the people who kept others in chains rarely expected resistance. They had grown comfortable. They had become careless. They believed in their own power so completely that they could not imagine it being challenged. That belief was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities could be exploited. Amara's plan relied on her particular skills. Among the supplies she had access to, there were several substances with multiple uses. One was a powder used to calm anxious camels, derived from a particular plant that grew along certain trade routes. In small doses, it made animals docile. In larger doses, it put them to sleep. In very large doses, it could stop a heart. There was a paste used to treat the wounds left by chains and ropes. It contained something that numbed pain. Applied to the skin in sufficient quantity, it could numb more than pain. There was a preparation used to ease stomach complaints. It induced vomiting. Applied to food, it could render a group of people incapable of fighting. She did not have enough of any single substance to affect all 12 guards, but she did not need to affect all of them. She only needed to affect enough. On the night before the transfer was to occur, Amara made her move. She approached the cook, an enslaved man who had been with Rashid for many years and had earned enough trust to handle food preparation. She did not ask him to join the conspiracy. She simply told him that she had noticed signs of illness among some of the caravan members and had prepared a medicine that should be added to the evening meal as a preventive measure. The cook did not question her. She was the healer. She had saved lives before. He added her preparation to the pot without tasting it, without examining it, without doubt. That evening, everyone in the caravan ate from the same pot. Pilgrims, guards, the enslaved, even Rashid himself. Amara had calculated the doses carefully. The enslaved had been eating less, were smaller, were weaker. They would receive smaller portions. The guards and Rashid would eat their fill, consuming significantly more of the treated food. Within 2 hours, the effects became apparent. It started with the guards complaining of stomach pain. Then the vomiting began. Then the weakness. Soon, half the caravan was doubled over in distress, unable to stand, unable to fight, barely able to crawl. Amara had taken only a small portion herself, knowing what was coming. Her co-conspirators had done the same. While the camp descended into chaos, while guards groaned and pilgrims prayed for deliverance from what they assumed was a desert sickness, 6 enslaved individuals quietly moved through the darkness. They worked in pairs, moving from guard to guard. Malik handled the fighters. He approached each one while they lay weakened, and with a rock or a piece of rope or his bare hands, he ensured they would not rise again. There was no pleasure in his work. There was no hesitation either. These men had whipped children. These men had separated mothers from babies. These men had participated in the destruction of entire villages, entire peoples, entire futures. They received what they had given. Kofi and Tembo secured the weapons, every club, every sword, every pistol. They moved silently, their movements masked by the groans of the sick and the confusion of the frightened pilgrims. Kesi and Jasiri gathered the children. One by one, they moved through the area where the enslaved slept, whispering in languages the young ones understood, telling them to be silent, to be ready, to trust. Amara went for Rashid. She found him in his tent, curled on his side, his fine robes soiled by his own sickness. He looked up as she entered, confusion in his eyes. He had not yet understood what was happening. He thought he was dying of natural causes, struck down by the will of a god whose name he invoked while profiting from the destruction of those made in that god's image. She stood over him. She did not speak. She waited for understanding to dawn. When it did, when his eyes widened and his mouth opened to call for help that would not come, she knelt beside him and spoke softly. She told him who she was. She told him what she had done. She told him about the children he had planned to sell, about the free girl he had planned to enslave, about the years of suffering he had inflicted on countless souls who had never done him any harm. She told him about her daughter, the one she had lost, the one she would never see again because of men like him. And then she told him that he would not live to see the sunrise. Rashid's death was not quick. It was not painless. It was exactly what he had earned through 11 years of treating human beings as commodities. When it was done, Amara emerged from the tent to find her work complete. The guards were neutralized. The weapons were secured. The children were assembled. The path forward was clear. But the night was not yet over. Dawn was still hours away when Amara addressed the pilgrims. They had gathered in frightened clusters, watching as the enslaved moved among them with weapons that had belonged to their captors. They expected slaughter. They expected revenge. They expected to die. Amara spoke in Arabic, clearly and calmly. She explained what had happened. She explained who Rashid was and what his caravan truly carried. She explained what had been planned for the Pilgrim family's daughter. Then she offered them a choice. They could remain with the caravan, take what remained of the supplies and camels, and continue their pilgrimage as they had intended. No harm would come to them. They had been victims of Rashid's deception as much as anyone. They were free to go with blessings and prayers, or they could bear witness. They could carry the story of what they had seen to Medina, to Mecca, to wherever their journeys took them. They could speak the names of the enslaved. They could describe the system that had hidden in plain sight among their sacred pilgrimage. They could ensure that this would not happen again. She did not ask them to help. She did not demand their allegiance. She simply offered them the choice that had been denied to her for 8 years, the choice to decide their own futures. Some pilgrims fled that same hour, taking what they could carry, disappearing into the darkness toward the nearest settlement. They wanted no part of whatever consequences might follow. Amara let them go without comment. Others stayed. Among them was the family whose daughter had been marked for enslavement. The father wept when he understood what had nearly happened. The mother held her child so tightly that the girl cried out in discomfort. They swore themselves to Amara's cause with an intensity that frightened her. They had looked into an abyss and seen their future erased. Now, they wanted that abyss destroyed. A handful of others remained as well. Some out of curiosity, some out of guilt for their previous silence, some out of genuine conviction that what they had witnessed demanded action. By the time the sun rose, Amara led a group of nearly 70 people. 43 formerly enslaved individuals, plus 20-some pilgrims who had chosen to stay, plus the children, plus the weapons and supplies of an entire caravan. It was not an army. It was barely a group. But it was free. They did not continue toward Medina. The city offered nothing for them except potential recapture. Instead, Amara led them west, toward the coast, toward the sea that had carried so many Africans into bondage. She had no clear destination. She had no established allies waiting. She had only a direction and a determination. But news travels strangely in the desert. By the second day after the rising, other caravans had encountered the pilgrims who had fled. By the third day, rumors were spreading through every well and way station between the coast and the holy cities. A slave caravan had been overthrown. A woman had led the uprising. Rashid al-Masri was dead, along with his guards, killed by his own merchandise. Some heard the story with fear. If it happened once, it could happen again. If the enslaved could organize, could plan, could execute such a reversal, then no slave owner was safe. The foundations of an entire economic system trembled. Others heard the story with hope. In the holding pens along the coast, in the dhows crossing the Red Sea, in the markets where human beings were bought and sold, the name Amara began to circulate. They did not know her real name. They did not know where she came from, but they knew that she had done the impossible. And impossible things, once done, become possible. Within weeks, there were 3 other incidents. A dhow carrying enslaved people across the Red Sea was seized by its cargo when the crew became complacent during a storm. A holding pen in a coastal town was set ablaze by its occupants, who escaped in the chaos. A caravan similar to Rashid's was attacked not by its enslaved cargo, but by local tribesmen who had heard the rumors and smelled opportunity in the confusion. The system that had operated smoothly for decades began to fray. Ottoman authorities, who had tolerated the pilgrimage trade as long as it remained discreet, suddenly found themselves pressured by European diplomats demanding action. British consuls cited the incidents as evidence that the empire was failing to enforce its own anti-slavery declarations. French officials expressed concern about the security of legitimate pilgrims. The Sublime Porte, already weakened by reforms and rebellions, could not afford another source of international embarrassment. Within 6 months of the rising, the Ottoman government announced new inspections of pilgrimage caravans. Within a year, the first significant arrests of slave traders operating under religious cover were made. Within 5 years, the pilgrimage route that Rashid had exploited would be closed to the trade entirely. None of this happened because of Amara alone. The forces of abolition had been building for decades. Economic changes, moral arguments, political pressures, diplomatic negotiations, all of these contributed to the eventual end of the trade. But Amara's rising was the spark that ignited a particular fire at a particular moment. It demonstrated that the enslaved were not passive victims waiting for rescue. It proved that resistance was possible even in the most controlled conditions. It shattered the illusion of security that had allowed traders like Rashid to operate in plain sight. The authorities could not let such a challenge go unanswered. Within days of the rising, a military force was dispatched from the nearest Ottoman garrison. Officially, they were searching for bandits who had attacked a pilgrim caravan. Unofficially, everyone knew what they were really hunting. Amara had expected this. She had not expected to escape forever. She had only hoped to lead her people far enough, long enough to give them a chance. The pursuit lasted 11 days. The first 3 days, she kept them moving, traveling at night to avoid the heat and observation, resting during the day in whatever shade the landscape offered. She sent scouts ahead and behind, using the skills that Malik and others had retained from their lives before captivity. They avoided the obvious routes, the wells where other travelers gathered, the paths that led to settlements. On the 4th day, they encountered another group. Not soldiers, not traders. A tribe of Bedouin who had heard the rumors and come to see for themselves whether they were true. The tribal elders studied Amara with an intensity that made lesser members of her group nervous. They asked her questions about what she had done and why. They asked about her origins, her people, her God. They asked about her plans. She told them the truth. She had no plans beyond reaching the coast. She had no destination beyond a way. She had no hope beyond the immediate survival of those she had freed. The elders conferred among themselves. Then their chief spoke. They would help, not because they opposed slavery, which some of them practiced in their own fashion. Not because they sympathized with Africans, who were foreign to them in language and culture and appearance. They would help because Amara had done something that deserved recognition. She had faced power and won. In a world where power seemed absolute and unchangeable, she had proved that it was neither. For that, they would give her 3 days. 3 days of guidance through territory they knew better than any Ottoman soldier. 3 days of food and water and rest. 3 days of misdirection, sending the pursuing force in wrong directions, buying time with false trails and misleading information. It was not enough to save her. Nothing would be enough to save her, but it was enough to save some of those she had freed. On the 7th day, Amara gathered her people and made an announcement. They could not all escape together. The group was too large, too slow, too conspicuous. The soldiers were too close, too determined, too numerous. If they stayed together, they would all be caught. If they separated, some might survive. She proposed dividing into smaller groups. Each group would take a different direction. Some would head toward the coast and try to find ships willing to carry them. Some would seek refuge with the Bedouin tribes. Some would attempt to lose themselves in the cities, to become invisible among the populations of free Africans who had settled in Arabia over generations. The children posed the greatest challenge. They could not travel fast or far. They could not defend themselves. They could not survive alone. Amara made arrangements. The pilgrim families who had joined them would take some of the children, incorporating them into their own groups, providing cover and care. The Bedouin had agreed to shelter others, raising them as members of their own tribes. Those children old enough to understand what was happening were given the choice of which path to take. Safia, the girl whose fate had triggered the rising, chose to stay with Amara. Amara tried to dissuade her. She explained that her own chances of survival were slim. She told Safia about the life she could have if she went with the Pilgrims or the Bedouin, the chance to grow up free, to marry, to have children of her own, to build a future. Safia listened. Then she said that Amara had saved her, not just from being sold, but from disappearing, from becoming nothing, from being erased. She would not abandon the person who had given her back her existence. They parted from the main group on the 8th night. Amara led a small band into the mountains, heading toward territory so harsh that pursuit would be difficult. She took only those who insisted on following her. Kofi, Malik, Safia, and 4 others who refused to leave her side. They knew they were unlikely to survive, but they had already survived the unsurvivable. Death held less terror for them than it once had. On the 11th day, the soldiers found them. They had taken shelter in a narrow valley, a place where ancient water had carved caves into the rock. It was defensible, if defense were possible. They had weapons taken from Rashid's guards. They had the high ground. They had the desperation of people with nothing left to lose. The Ottoman commander offered terms: surrender, and the survivors would be enslaved rather than executed. The woman who had led the rising would be taken to face justice. The children would be sold. The men would be sent to labor in quarries or fields. It was mercy of a sort. Amara's answer was delivered not in words but in action. She fired one of Rashid's pistols at the commander's standard-bearer, missing the man but hitting the flag, tearing a hole through the Ottoman crescent. The battle lasted 3 hours. They killed 7 soldiers before the ammunition ran out. They killed 4 more with swords and rocks and bare hands before the numbers overwhelmed them. One by one, the defenders fell. Kofi died protecting Safia, his body pierced by 3 blades before he stopped moving. Malik died facing 5 enemies at once, taking 2 of them with him into whatever waited beyond. The others fell in their own moments of final defiance, each refusing to surrender, each choosing death over return to chains. In the end, only Amara and Safia remained, barricaded in the deepest cave, wounded but alive. The soldiers called for surrender one final time. They promised that the child would be treated gently. They promised that Amara's death would be quick. Amara looked at Safia. The girl was 12 years old. She had been enslaved, rescued, pursued, and now cornered. She had watched people die for her. She had held a weapon of her own, though Amara had forbidden her from using it. There was no way out. There was no more hope. There was only this moment and whatever came next. Amara spoke to Safia in the old language, the one she had never taught anyone in captivity, the one that held her first name and her mother's stories, and the memory of the lake where she had been born. She told Safia that she was proud of her. She told her that what they had done mattered, even if no one remembered. She told her that the fire they had started would keep burning long after they were ash. Then she turned to face the entrance of the cave, where the soldiers were preparing their final assault. Her last words were simple. She spoke them in Arabic, loudly enough for the soldiers to hear. I am Amara. I was free before you were born. I will be free after you are dead. And those who come after me will remember that freedom cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered. I do not surrender. The soldiers found 2 bodies in the cave. The woman had died from a sword wound to the chest, dealt while she was fighting. The girl had died from the same poison that Amara had used against Rashid's guards. She had chosen her own end rather than return to slavery. They buried neither of them. The official records state that a group of runaway slaves was apprehended and executed in the mountains near the Hejaz in the autumn of 1859. No names are given. No details are provided. The incident is listed as a minor disturbance, handled efficiently by the regional authorities, but official records are not the only records. Among the pilgrims who had joined Amara's group, several survived to complete their Hajj. They carried the story with them to Mecca, to Medina, to their homes across the Muslim world. They told their families, their communities, their children. The story spread from mouth to ear, transforming as it traveled, becoming larger than any single event. Among the children who had been distributed among different groups, most survived. They grew up in Bedouin tents, in coastal towns, in cities where the African presence had existed for centuries. They carried fragments of the story, pieces of memory, names and faces and moments that they passed down to their own descendants. Among the enslaved who had dispersed across different directions, some reached freedom. They found ships. They found refuge. They built new lives in places where the traders could not reach them, and they remembered. The story of Amara became one of those tales that defies verification. Some historians dismiss it as legend, pointing to the lack of documentation, the inconsistencies between different versions, the impossibility of confirming details from so long ago. Other researchers find traces in unexpected places, references in letters, notations in shipping records, fragments of oral history collected from communities along the Red Sea coast. The truth is that it does not matter whether every detail can be verified. What matters is what the story meant to those who heard it. For enslaved Africans in the region, Amara became a symbol. She was proof that resistance was possible. She was evidence that the chains could be broken. She was the answer to the despair that threatened to consume anyone trapped in an inhumane system. For the traders and their allies, she became a nightmare. Every sick camel, every food that tasted strange, every enslaved person who seemed too calm, too observant, too quiet, became a potential Amara. The paranoia spread through the system like the disease she had used against Rashid's guards. For the reformers and abolitionists, she became ammunition. Her story was cited in diplomatic meetings, in parliamentary debates, in the pamphlets and petitions that demanded an end to the trade. She was evidence that the enslaved were not passive victims, but active agents of their own liberation. And for generations of people whose ancestors had been taken from Africa, she became memory. A name, a story, a connection to a past that had been deliberately erased. In the years that followed, other women rose. There was Halima, who had been among those dispersed from Amara's group. She reached the coast and found passage on a ship bound for the Indian subcontinent. But she did not stay there. She returned. She learned to navigate the dhows that crossed the Red Sea, and she became something unprecedented, a woman who rescued others. For 12 years, Halima operated a network that no authority ever fully understood. She identified ships carrying enslaved cargo. She bribed crew members. She created distractions, diversions, opportunities for escape. By some estimates, she helped more than 200 people reach freedom before she disappeared from the historical record in 1871. There was Miriam, a child of 8 when Amara's rising occurred, too young to participate but old enough to remember. She was taken in by a Bedouin tribe and raised as one of their own. When she reached womanhood, she used her position between worlds to advocate for change. She spoke to travelers and traders, to officials and scholars. She told Amara's story to anyone who would listen, and she told it in a way that made people uncomfortable. She was killed in 1878, murdered by men who believed that certain stories should remain untold. But by then, the story had spread too far to be silenced. There was Zara, whose connection to Amara was tenuous, possibly invented. She claimed to have met the liberator during the 11 days of flight, to have received instructions and blessings before the final parting. Whether this was true or not, Zara used the claim to build a following. She organized communities of freed Africans along the Arabian coast. She established schools where children learned to read and write, where the history of the slave trade was taught not as an abstraction, but as a living memory. Some called her a fraud. Some called her a saint. What matters is that her schools survived her, that the stories she taught continued to be told, that the children she educated grew up to educate others. The fire Amara started did not burn in a single flame. It scattered into sparks that landed in unexpected places and kindled new blazes. Not everyone who carried Amara's story did so for noble reasons. Within months of the rising, there were already those who sought to profit from it. Traders sold amulets supposedly touched by the liberator. Guides offered to show travelers the exact location of Rashid's death, charging handsomely for the privilege. Writers in Cairo and Istanbul published sensationalized accounts, mixing fact with fiction until the line between them dissolved entirely. Some of these merchants of memory did real damage. They reduced a complex story to a simple tale of revenge. They stripped away the context of the pilgrimage trade, the systematic nature of the oppression, the careful planning that made the rising possible. They turned Amara into a character rather than a person, a symbol rather than a human being who had made impossible choices under impossible circumstances. But even the exploitation served a purpose. Every sensationalized account reached readers who might otherwise never have learned of the trade. Every fraudulent amulet prompted questions about the woman it supposedly commemorated. Every guide who pointed to a patch of desert and claimed it was sacred ground reminded travelers that something had happened here, something worth remembering, something that challenged the comfortable assumptions of a world built on human trafficking. The truth survived within the distortions, like a seed preserved in amber, waiting for conditions that would allow it to grow. In the archives of the Ottoman Empire, there are references to a trial. The documents are fragmentary, damaged by water and time and deliberate destruction. What remains suggests that authorities in Medina attempted to prosecute someone connected to Amara's rising. The charges included murder, theft, destruction of property, and incitement to rebellion. The defendant's name is illegible. The outcome of the trial is not recorded, but certain details survive. The prosecution called witnesses who described the night of the rising. They spoke of the screams of the poisoned, the violence of the retribution, the chaos of the escape. They painted a picture of savagery and barbarism, of enslaved people reverting to their supposed natural state of violence when given the opportunity. The defense, if there was a defense, appears to have argued something different. There are fragments of testimony that describe the conditions under which the enslaved had lived. There are references to children separated from parents, to punishments inflicted for minor infractions, to the sale of human beings as though they were livestock. The judge, if there was a judge, faced an impossible situation. To condemn the defendant was to ignore the context that had made the rising necessary. To acquit was to legitimize violence against established order, against the economic interests that depended on the trade, against the entire system that held the empire together. Perhaps the trial ended in execution. Perhaps it ended in imprisonment. Perhaps it never concluded at all, lost in the bureaucratic labyrinth of an empire in decline. What matters is that someone was forced to consider, in an official capacity, whether Amara's actions were crimes or justice. Someone was forced to weigh the value of human property against the value of human freedom. Someone was forced to acknowledge, even if only to reject, the possibility that the enslaved had the right to resist their enslavement. That acknowledgement, however brief, however incomplete, was a crack in the wall. And cracks, given time, become openings. Amara spoke at least 5 languages. This detail, preserved in the testimony of pilgrims who encountered her, reveals something essential about who she was and how she accomplished what she did. Her first language was the one of her birth, spoken along the shores of Lake Tanganyika, a tongue that had no written form but carried centuries of stories, prayers, healing knowledge, history. This was the language of her mother, of the grandmother she remembered only dimly, of the community that had shaped her before the raiders came. Her second language was Swahili, the trading tongue of the East African coast. She learned it during the long march from her homeland to the sea, forced to communicate with captors and fellow captives who spoke different mother tongues. This was the language of survival, of negotiation, of the market where she was first sold. Her third language was Arabic, learned in fragments during her years of slavery. She had been sold to households where Arabic was spoken, and she had absorbed it the way plants absorb sunlight, unconsciously, inevitably. By the time she joined Rashid's caravan, she spoke it well enough to fool pilgrims into thinking she was one of them. Her fourth language was the language of herbs and poisons. She knew which plants healed and which killed, which roots calmed the mind and which stopped the heart. This knowledge was its own form of speech, a vocabulary of remedies and threats that she had carried from her mother's teachings through every transfer of ownership. Her fifth language was the language of watching. She read faces. She interpreted gestures. She understood the meaning of a guard's yawn, a merchant's hesitation, a child's silence. This language had no words, but it was perhaps the most important she spoke. It was this final language that enabled everything else. Because she could read the Caravan as others read books, she knew when to act. Because she understood the subtleties of human behavior, she could predict how people would respond to crisis. Because she had spent 8 years watching and waiting and learning, she could execute a plan that required perfect timing and absolute commitment. The rising was not a spontaneous act of desperation. It was a composed symphony, performed in 5 languages at once. Of the 25 children in Rashid's caravan, historians have been able to trace the fates of 11. 3 were taken in by the Bedouin tribes that helped Amara during her flight. They grew up as nomads, their African origins fading into the tapestry of tribal identity. Their descendants still live in the region, though most have forgotten the circumstances that brought their ancestors there. 2 were absorbed into pilgrim families. They completed the Hajj, traveled to Mecca and Medina as free children rather than enslaved property, and eventually settled in the Levant. One became a merchant of some modest success. The other became a teacher, spending her life educating girls in a time when female education was rare. 4 made it to the coast and eventually crossed back to Africa. Their journeys took years, passing through ports and ships and temporary refuges before they finally reached the eastern coast of the continent. What happened to them after that is lost to history, but the fact that they returned suggests something about the power of homeland, about the pull of origin that not even years of captivity could erase. 2 died during the flight. 1 succumbed to a fever contracted during the desert crossing. The other was killed in the final battle, caught in the crossfire between Amara's defenders and the Ottoman soldiers. Their names are not recorded anywhere except in the memories of those who knew them. The fates of the remaining 14 are unknown. They dispersed into a world that did not keep careful records of African children, that did not consider their lives significant enough to document. They may have thrived or suffered, lived long or died young, remembered Amara or forgotten her entirely. What matters is that 11 survived to adulthood. 11 children who were being transported as merchandise became 11 human beings with futures of their own. 11 lives that Amara's rising redirected from certain misery to uncertain possibility. Some would argue that 11 out of 25 represents failure, that Amara should have waited for a better moment, a safer opportunity, a plan with higher odds of success. But those who were saved did not consider it failure, and neither did their children, or their children's children, or the generations that followed. To them, Amara was the reason they existed at all. The pilgrimage slave trade did not end with Amara's rising. It continued for decades more, gradually declining under pressure from multiple directions. The last verified pilgrimage caravan carrying enslaved people was intercepted in the early 20th century, more than 40 years after Amara's death. But something changed in 1859. The assumption of safety was shattered. The illusion of control was broken. The system continued, but it was never quite the same. In the decades that followed, the Ottoman Empire implemented increasingly strict regulations on pilgrimage traffic. European powers expanded their surveillance of Red Sea shipping. International agreements established protocols for inspecting suspicious vessels. The infrastructure of the trade was systematically dismantled. None of this happened quickly. None of it happened cleanly. There were setbacks and reversals, corrupt officials, and continued violations. The end of the trade was not a single moment, but a process that took generations. But when historians trace that process, they often return to the autumn of 1859. They return to a caravan that appeared to be carrying pilgrims to the holy cities. They return to a woman who refused to accept that her chains were permanent. They return to Amara. There is a song that some communities along the East African coast still sing. It has no author. It has no fixed melody. Different groups perform it differently with different words, different rhythms, different instruments. But the core remains consistent. It tells of a woman who walked in chains but was never enslaved. It tells of a night when the oppressed became the liberators. It tells of fire and poison and blood and freedom. It tells of children who escaped and children who died and children who remembered. The song does not use the name Amara. It uses older names, names in languages that predate Arabic influence, names that connect the story to deeper traditions of resistance and survival. Those who sing it say that the song is older than the events it describes. They say that it tells a story that has happened many times, in many places, whenever a people have been oppressed beyond endurance. They say that Amara was only one incarnation of a spirit that rises again and again, whenever someone refuses to accept that their humanity can be bought and sold. They say that as long as the song is sung, the spirit survives. And they sing. In a private collection in Istanbul, there is a pistol that is said to have belonged to Rashid al-Masri. It was recovered from the site of his death and passed through several hands before reaching its current location. The collector who owns it does not display it publicly. He does not speak about its history, but those who have seen it say that there is a mark on the handle, carved crudely, perhaps with a nail or a sharp stone. The mark resembles a symbol used by certain East African peoples to ward off evil spirits. In a museum in London, there is a fragment of chain recovered from the route between the Red Sea coast and Medina. It is dated to the mid-19th century. The documentation describes it as an example of the equipment used in the Arabian slave trade. There is no mention of how it was recovered or from whom, but there are scratches on the interior of the links, patterns that look random at first glance, but when examined closely, resolve into marks. Counting marks. Days, perhaps, or miles, or something else entirely. In an archive in Cairo, there is a letter written by an Ottoman official in late 1859. It reports on the incidents of that autumn, describing the security measures taken and the success of the military response. It is a bureaucratic document, dry and factual, the kind of letter written by men who have learned to describe horrors without emotion. But in the margin, in handwriting that does not match the rest of the letter, someone has written 3 words. The words are in Arabic. They translate roughly as "she was right." There is no indication of who wrote them or when or why, but they remain there, visible to anyone who examines the document closely. A dissent, a memorial, a truth that refused to be erased. History asks us to judge. It presents figures and events and demands that we assess their significance, their morality, their legacy. Was Amara a hero or a murderer? Was her rising justified or excessive? Did her actions advance the cause of freedom or merely provoke futile suffering? These questions assume that history is a court of law, where verdicts must be rendered and sentences pronounced. They assume that the past can be tidied into categories of right and wrong, success and failure, progress and regression. But the people who lived through these events did not experience them as history. They experienced them as life, as terror, as hope, as impossible choices made under impossible conditions. Amara killed men. This is fact. She poisoned and stabbed and shot human beings who would not have died without her actions. Some of those men had families. Some of them may have been caught in the system as surely as those they guarded, born into a world where such work was available and other options were not. Amara saved lives. This is also fact. She freed 43 people from bondage. She prevented the enslavement of an innocent child. She sparked a chain of events that contributed, in ways large and small, to the eventual end of an abomination. Both facts are true. Both must be acknowledged. Neither cancels the other. What remains is the question that her story poses to every generation. What would you do? If you were walking in chains under a foreign sky, watching children be sold, knowing that your own future held nothing but labor and suffering and death, what would you do? Would you endure, hoping for rescue that might never come? Would you accept your fate as the will of a god or the luck of birth? Would you tell yourself that survival was enough, that living was itself a form of resistance? Or would you fight? Would you risk everything on a chance of freedom? Would you accept that victory might mean death? That liberation might require killing? That the price of breaking your chains might be blood on your hands? Amara made her choice. The consequences of that choice rippled outward, touching lives she never knew, shaping events she never witnessed, creating a legend that survived her by more than a century and a half. Whether her choice was right or wrong is not for us to say. We did not walk in her chains. We did not face her enemies. We did not make her impossible decisions. All we can do is remember. All we can do is listen to the song they still sing. All we can do is ask ourselves the question she asked with her life. If you watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our world forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so that I can know you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Amara's story touched your heart. Share so that Amara's memory will never be forgotten.